Yeah, it's certainly an important development. I mean, this is a situation that's ripe for miscalculation, and most catastrophes occur not because someone does something deliberately, but because they mess something up. And I think having inspectors in there is just the first step. I think more is required, but it's certainly an important first step.
And what do you expect the inspectors to find?
Oh, I think the Russians will probably clean out the trucks with ammunition on them that we've all seen videos of in the last day or so. They'll probably look at how the plant is operating, how the safety standards are being adhered to, how the staff are being treated. They'll be very important parts of the inspection. And then they'll get a sense of, how close is the fighting and these kind of issues as well, I would expect.
And French President Emmanuel Macron claiming this as something of a diplomatic victory, in a sense. His conversation, it seems, with Vladimir Putin led to these inspectors being allowed into the nuclear complex. What does this do, if anything, Mick? I mean, it might be nothing, but what does this do to the sort of the power dynamics here between a Western leader and Putin?
I'm not sure it really says much at all, to be quite frank. It was pretty easy for Putin to say yes to this one. If he had have agreed to fully withdraw from Ukraine in the next 7 days, that would have been a much better outcome. But I'm not sure this really changes the power dynamics at this point in time.
Outlined your a 5-point plan, 5 conditions on which you think Ukraine can win this war. And if you will, I'd like to take a whistle-stop tour through them. And it starts with that, doesn't it, really? Western support and Western leadership.
Yeah, no, it's pretty important. I mean, the West's political support for this war has been vital to President Zelensky and his military and his people throughout this war. The West has a stake here. The Ukrainians are fighting for their sovereignty and for their form of democracy. And if one is worth defending, they're all worth defending.
There's some polling in the Times this weekend, Mick, last weekend, actually. You may not have seen it, but it pointed to a shift, a small shift, but a shift all the same in attitudes as attention moves away to various different things, various different countries around the world, that support is starting to shift slightly as well in some quarters. Does that concern you?
It does. I think it was pretty impressive, the amount of support that was generated for Ukraine early on. But, people have lives to live. They have children to school and feed, or partners to look after. And it's easy to get distracted when energy prices are going through the roof, where the price to fuel up your car is much more expensive. But the reality is, I think most people still support Ukraine's cause. They're just being distracted by other things that are happening in their lives at the moment.
Which leads us to financial support, doesn't it? And you point, Mick, to that being one of the pillars that is needed here for Ukraine, a continued financial support from Western countries.
Absolutely. It costs money to fight a war, and it costs money to run your government. And when your revenue stream is being throttled by the Russian invaders, by cutting off your access to outside markets, by holding your ports, whilst there's been some small resumption of grain exports, the Ukrainians' capacity to generate a revenue has been limited. So they will need economic support throughout the war, and they'll certainly need it after the war to rebuild.
And that's obviously, Mick, contributed to a knock-on effect through the Western world, hasn't it? And prices rising and governments having to step in to intervene to support their own people through those rising prices. How concerned are you that governments sort of will feel they have to make a decision between supporting Ukraine or their own people?
I'm not sure it's that stark. The governments of the West, I think, will continue to support Ukraine. I think the real rub is less the choice between Ukraine and their own people. It's how much they can continue to support Ukraine with military assistance, given that most Western military organisations have had to dig pretty deep in their inventories for weapons and munitions for this. And they're probably getting to the point where they may need to make hard choices about their own preparedness and supporting Ukraine with more Western military assistance.
And what does that look like, Nick, in terms of, I guess, numbers for the financial support, but also in terms of equipment and commitment to training programs? Can you put some sort of meat on the bones of what that support should look like and continue to look like from Western countries?
Well, there's a couple of really important things I think we can do moving forward. The first one is a more standardized approach to the equipment that's being provided to the Ukrainians. At the moment, they have one of every type of artillery system from every Western military organization. That might help right now, but in the medium term, it's going to be very difficult to support. I also think the training regime that's been established by the British Army in the United Kingdom is an excellent initiative. And what we might do is consider something like we did in the Second World War with the Empire Air Training System, where every country uses a standardized training program to train some Ukrainian soldiers. I think that would be a good NATO initiative.
How much of a concern is there that a threshold is reached where Vladimir Putin can point to this support and say, this constitutes an intervention? We are now at war with the NATO country.
I don't know he's going to do that. It'd have to be a pretty high bar. He has had trouble with one country of 44 million people with a smaller economy of his. The EU and NATO more broadly is vastly more militarily capable and economically richer. Putin does not want to fight with NATO here. So I think that we're not likely to see that in the near term unless you see NATO armies rolling into Ukraine, and NATO's made it very clear it won't be doing that.
You talked about leadership as well, haven't you? And that being sort of the fourth pillar, the fourth foundation of the five. And Volodymyr Zelensky's own leadership and some strong Western leadership as well in many countries. If you were in the ear of Western leaders, Mick, today, and you were talking to them, how do they continue to convince their people and the West that this is something that they need to be in for the whole 9 yards?
Well, Zelensky, as you've noted, has provided an exemplar of wartime leadership, and it's almost Churchillian in some respects. And he has been the leader of the hour for his country, but in many respects for the international community. For Western leaders, this is about them convincing their own people, as you've just noted, that, if one democracy is worth preserving and defending, they're all worth preserving and defending. They're all different in some way, but they're all worth defending equally. And it will cost money, but it's not costing people in Western countries their lives like it is the Ukrainians. For them, it's an existential fight.
As you probably know, Mick, we're in the middle of a leadership election here. Either Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss will become the Prime Minister on the 5th of September. And one of the top things in their in tray, of course, will be this. I imagine a phone call with President Zelensky will come soon after, I imagine probably on the first day. What do they say in that call?
Well, hopefully they'll say, we remain with you. The British policy of supporting Ukraine has not changed, despite the change in leadership of the government at the moment. And they will stay with Ukraine to the end, just as NATO and the United States has undertaken to do so.
And you've also pointed, Mick, to a battlefield victory, that the Ukrainians simply have to win this war on the battlefield. How realistic is this?
Yeah, I think it is realistic. We've seen throughout this war the Russian military performance in close combat has been quite poor. It's only been through their massive use of artillery they've been able to make any gains in the east, and even that's been minor because they just don't have the infantry to make larger breakthroughs. The influx of a small number of HIMARS and the multi-launch rocket systems that countries like Britain have provided have actually had a really significant impact. And we shouldn't forget, a country of 44 million has fought a superpower to a standstill. That is a significant achievement. The Russians are really hurting, and they're casting about looking for something they can call a success at the moment, and they're coming up empty.
And strategically, Mick, what does a Ukrainian victory on the battlefield look like? Could you sort of paint that picture for us in the next, I mean, it may be years rather than months, but how does that play out?
It's certainly not going to be weeks or months, although we all hope that there might be some kind of breakthrough in the south. At the end of the day, Russia has to leave Ukrainian soil, and that includes Crimea and the Donbass. And the Ukrainians are going to have to beat them on the battlefield, probably through dislocation rather than destroying the Russian army, like they did in the north and the northeast around Kharkiv. But one way or the other, the Ukrainians are going to have to beat the Russian army and force them to leave Ukraine.
We aren't far from winter either. It's August now. It'll be around before you know it. How does that change the dynamic of the war?
Well, there's an old saying that the jungle is neutral, and it's the same with winter. Both Ukraine and Russia are used to bitterly cold winters. They know what it's like to operate in them. They know that it slows down operations. It prevents helicopters and aircraft flying at times and collecting intelligence. But they're both countries who have long histories in fighting through winters, or at least operating through them. So I think we'll see a slowdown in the pace of operations, but this won't stop the war by any means.
We've also had our eye, haven't we, Nick, on the sort of knock-on effects to this. What this, whether this sort of spurs on and encourages and inspires other states who may be inclined to want to claim other territories. Of course, China and Taiwan, probably, point number one on that. We've seen military operations from China that Taiwan have claimed are then preparing for an invasion. If we're to take a sort of step back and look at the broader picture here, Nick, how concerned are you about a knock-on effect through the world and this effectively happening again in the form of China and Taiwan or others?
I think it's eminently possible that it can happen again. It's been happening for thousands of years, where every now and then someone decides the best way to get something they want is through war. The Chinese in particular are watching very closely. They've been very clear about their designs on Taiwan. There's no shades of grey there. They've been quite explicit that Taiwan is there and they're going to take it one way or the other. They will have been watching this, and there's a whole lot of lessons the Chinese will have learned, including just watching how NATO and the United States has reacted in this war, to see what kind of playbook they might roll out for some kind of contingency over Taiwan in the future.